Hello, Matt Gilby here with My Agent Real Estate. I'm joined today by two of our star senior property managers, Amy McIntosh and Leah Stewart. We're just doing this piece of content just as a follow-up to the email that we sent out last week in relation to the Residential Tenancies Act 132 reform changes. There's been a few concerns raised and brought forward to some of our property managers, so we thought we'd just go through a few of them and debunk a couple of the issues that we've been hearing. So we've got a couple of points here to go through. The first one being urgent maintenance with a spend of $2,500. One of the common questions that are coming forward is that a tenant can pay $2,500 of my money without consent. So urgent maintenance.
Not correct. The urgent maintenance has increased from $1,800 to $2,500. The $1,800 has always been there for urgent repairs only. An example of that would be if a hot water service bursts at 2 a.m. in the morning and they are unable to contact one of our emergency tradesmen, and that they just have to call someone because water's going everywhere and we need to stop that emergency.
So to prevent damage to the property.
Exactly. Yeah. So we need to try to mitigate that loss to the landlord, because ultimately if we allow that emergency to run, that it will cost more if it's not dealt with immediately.
That's right. And the change is going from an $1,800 spend to a $2,500 spend. So it's always been there. And reality is, if you think back over the last 10 years, the amount of urgent maintenance call-outs that have been, it's very, very few. So we don't anticipate that it's going to increase. And reality is that it's there as a safety measure to protect the property long term. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you've only used it
once in the 12 years that I've been doing this. I've had a tenant who there was some damage to a lock and they couldn't get into the property and they had to call a locksmith. So that was on a Sunday. You know, we weren't available to give the keys to the tenant at that time. They called a locksmith and they reimbursed that. So yeah, that was about $300.
Exactly right.
I don't think I've ever used it.
The other thing to consider too is that they're our trades. So, you know, if a tenant were to go through the after-hour procedure that we have online, they're talking to people that we use all of the time. So, you know, they're going to try and troubleshoot. They're going to try and identify the issue. If they need to switch power off or water off or something like that, and it can be delayed to a later point where they can do the work during normal hours. That's what's going to happen. So it's not really much to be concerned about. Urgent maintenance has always been there. It's just a little bit of a raise in terms of what can be spent in total. So the second one that's common is to do with arrears, and we've seen a lot of stuff in the media about this and a lot of misinformation going out there. So the common questions that we're getting is that a tenant doesn't have to pay the rent and we can't kick them out. So the process has changed slightly. There's now a 5-strike policy with each tenancy or each tenancy in the property. So what that means is if a tenant does get 14 days behind in their rent, we can issue them a notice to vacate on that 15th day. Any time from that date to the termination date, which is the date we're asking them to leave the property, they need to pay their rent in full. If they pay their rent in full for the arrears owing at that time, then the notice to vacate is cancelled. We don't need to go to Vacate. The rent's paid up to date, so that's fine. But that is 1 strike on their tenancy. So a tenant can do that up to 5 times in a 12-month period or in a 12-month lease. On the 5th time, regardless whether they pay their arrears up to date or not, we can apply to Vacate. So with Vacate as well, just as you know, information that is coming through to us is that they are going to be pushing for payment plans to work with a tenant. So, warrant of possessions aren't going to be as common. So it's very important to make sure you're screening for, good tenants in your properties as well. Absolutely. And look, the key message is that they still need to pay their rent in full. So yes, they do get 5 strikes, but if they don't pay their rent in full, that's a different situation. So, it's not something that we really need to be overly concerned about. It's tenants in general pay their rent on time and they do a good job. For the select few that don't, there still is very black and white rules around what should be done. So the next one that's coming up, which is quite a big one, we've had a lot of questions about this one, is modifications. One of the common questions that does come up is a tenant can inappropriately modify my property without my permission. And again, that's not strictly true, is it?
No. So there's definitely changes to these rules. So a tenant can put picture hooks up, put a TV bracket up. If the shower head isn't water efficient,
Paint the walls.
they can paint a wall.
LED lights.
LED lights. They can make these changes without having to ask the landlord now. However, they do have to restore the premises back to original condition, and it must be a tradesman-like condition.
Yeah.
So they can't go and put 50 picture hooks up on one wall and then just put a little bit of putty on it and think that it's all good. It does need to be repainted and returned
to a good standard.
in a professional-like standard.
Yeah.
So it definitely, it can be a little bit scary, but at the end of the day, I think that any tenant that does make these type of modifications is most likely going to be beneficial to the property.
You're talking about adding pictures to the walls and maybe putting up some curtains. These are all things that I think are improvements and that show that you've got a long-term tenant who wants to look after your property.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's it. I guess the other thing to consider with this is that our senior property managers have a lot of experience. So when we consider doing our condition reports, photos of every square inch of the property with a lot of detail about what's there. So if they do go ahead and repaint a wall, we know about it because when we come to do the exit report or the routines along the way, we've got those reports as a reference point. So certainly they can make some alterations. We feel like the majority of these things will be an improvement to the property, and we've got checks and balances to make sure that everything's returned in a good working order in to a tradesman-like condition, like you said.
I think, as you said, that the condition reports are key moving forward. That a 12 photo for a 3-bedroom property just won't cut it now.
Yeah.
You definitely need to make sure that every inch of that property is photographed, and the condition report, you set the tenancy up right.
Yep, absolutely. Next one that we're getting is actually a rule that was introduced nearly 12 months ago now, that I can't say no to a pet request. This is a very common one that comes up. Leah.
Yeah, so I guess the new process now for pets is that you cannot unreasonably refuse a pet request. So a tenant they still need to request permission to have a pet at the property. They have a prescribed form that they must fill out to present that to us or to the landlord. And then you as the landlord have 14 days to respond to that. So if you think that, that pet is not appropriate for that property, you just need to apply to Vacate, and then a Vacate member or a judge will hear that matter and they will rule whether it's appropriate or not for the animal to be in the premises.
That's right. And look, it's not really something that a lot of tenants have pets. So if you were to just have a blanket rule of flat out no pets, you're wiping out a huge market. You're wiping out a lot of tenants that can potentially move in. We find that most people that have pets are still respectful and
very forthcoming,
absolutely,
and straightforward.
A lot of them nowadays too have had a pet in a previous property, so we can actually get that pet reference as well, which I think is so beneficial.
The bottom line is they need to return the property back in a satisfactory condition. So that just because this legislation was introduced 12 months ago, that it doesn't change the fact that they can't destroy the place and the pet can't destroy the place. It's got to be returned back in a satisfactory condition, and that's a part of what we do. That's our job, to make sure that it is returned in that way, or compensation is requested.
I think as well, it's also good to remember that if I was an owner, I would want to know if there was going to be a pet at a property rather than a tenant trying to hide that fact. So if you've got someone that's coming up and they're being honest and saying, I do have a pet and I would like permission to have them there, I think that it's ultimately a good thing, so that at least you're aware there is an animal in the property. And then there's extra things that we can check at the end of a tenancy to make sure there's no damages.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed. The next one that's coming up a fair bit is the removal of the 120-day notice to vacate with no reason. The common question that's coming up is, I can't end a tenancy anymore. So that is correct. 120-day notice has been removed. However, all of the other notices still stand. And that's really important. The only slight difference is that the end of fixed term tenancy now applies to the first tenancy only. So it's just, everything's still the same. You still speak to your property manager and work out if you need to serve a notice, what might be appropriate in that circumstance. Absolutely, and 99.99% of our leases are 12 months. So That's 2 routine inspections in that time frame to have a look at the property condition. It's 12 months worth of rent payments to figure out, whether it's a suitable fit or not. So there's still plenty of different options to make sure that the property is being well and truly looked after.
And if I would just add, if on the second or third term or lease that does come up, if a tenant does start getting behind with rent, then there is that still procedure there to go to Vacate for rent arrears. So all the other notices are still there. You can still get, if there's an issue or if your circumstances change and you need to move back into the property, those notices are still valid.
It's purely only the removal of 120-day notice.
After the first, that's it. Another sort of probably the biggest question that keeps coming up is to do with cost. What's this all going to cost? As an owner, will this cost me more money? And I guess the short answer is yes. It's to do really with
the compliance checks, mandatory safety compliance checks on your property that is legislated that have to be done for your property to be leased and tenanted.
Ultimately, though, it will improve your property and hopefully
pick up any maintenance that maybe have been sitting there for 2 or 3 years. Might be something to do with the hot water service, hasn't been checked in a few years, and then your hot water service blows up. So
and it could be a couple of $100 fix rather than a few thousand.
Replacing hot water.
Hopefully that we can detect things earlier, and it will ultimately save everyone in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the bottom line is with these new regulations that are coming in force, it's been a slow introduction. So we've had 2 years to prepare ourselves for this, and we've done a lot of different training sessions, and we've gone through the different regs that have come out, and we're equipped to handle it. So this is not something that we should really worry about too much. There's certainly some changes, but a lot of benefits. And for all the negative media reports that are coming out that you're reading or watching, the reality is that we're best to go to the source and figure out exactly what it is. And we encourage you to call us to have those conversations. So we've sent out the email with all the regulations. If you haven't seen those regulations, please let us know, and we'll send that through to you. We also will do a follow-up next week with frequently asked questions. So we're already getting a lot through, and we do want to give a little bit more detail to those that are interested in it. Things along the lines of the disclosure statements, the minimum standards, the penalty units, professional cleaning, non-compliant registers, the changes to bonds. There's a few others as well that are coming through. So we are hearing you, we are hearing these questions, and we're going to do another session next week to go through some of those items. We very much do encourage you to send through those questions to your property manager or direct to me, because we would ideally like to share those questions and those answers across our My Agent family. So thanks for joining us today. We'll look forward to tuning in next week, or you tuning in next week, to go through the frequently asked questions.